If you were a woman in 1847, you were your father's daughter when you were born, and your husband's wife when you were married. You could not purchase land in your own name. You could not sign a contract in your own name. You could not even speak in court on your own behalf. If you were the daughter of a wealthy family, it was a slightly more comfortable cage, silk curtains, piano lessons, walks in the garden, but a cage nonetheless. Eleanor Ashworth grew up in exactly such a world. In the north of Yorkshire, a small estate tucked between the hills. From the outside, Ashworth Manor still carried itself with dignity. The ivy was neat, the garden well kept, a few good horses remained in the stables. But inside, it had long since begun to rot. Eleanor had known it for years. The growing stacks of papers on her father's desk, the tone of the letters that arrived, the servants disappearing one by one, they all told the same story. Sir Aldrich Ashworth had been slowly destroying his family's future at the gambling tables. Eleanor's mother had died 5 years earlier, not from illness, it would be more accurate to say from exhaustion, from carrying this house, this man, this life. Before she died, she had called Eleanor to her side and given her a small wooden box. Inside was a letter and an address in London. Her mother had said only this: "I hope you never have to open it, but if you do, do not hesitate." Eleanor had kept that box under her bed for 5 years. She had never opened it, because there was still hope. Perhaps her father would recover, perhaps things would improve, perhaps her mother had been afraid for nothing. Until that morning. That morning, Eleanor was walking toward her father's room. The door was slightly open, and a voice she did not recognize was coming from inside. There was a stranger there, speaking with her father. Eleanor's name was mentioned, then a number, then a name, the Duke of Ravenmore. For a moment her feet froze where she stood. Then everything fell into place in her mind. Her father's strange silence over the past months, the way he could not look at her, the way he avoided her eyes at dinner, all of it suddenly made sense. Sir Aldrich Ashworth was selling his daughter to a duke for £500. The papers would be signed in 3 days. Her father stepped out of the room and saw her. They looked at each other for 2 seconds. He tried to speak, opened his mouth, said something about debts, that there had been no other choice, that the Duke was a good man, that this was for Eleanor's own good. You know these words, the kind spoken to quiet a conscience, but that quiet no one. Eleanor listened. She looked at her father's face, that tired, guilty face that had not even managed to convince itself. And without saying a single word, she turned and went to her room. She closed the door, sat on her bed. She did not cry. She did not shout, because Eleanor was that kind of person, the kind who carried the greatest pain inside and let nothing escape. Perhaps she had learned it from her mother. Perhaps she had learned it growing up in this house. Whatever the reason, she sat and waited and let the storm inside her pass. Then she bent down and pulled the wooden box from beneath her bed. Her mother had been right. She had seen this 5 years ago. She had not left that box, that letter, that address without reason. Eleanor opened the letter. The paper had yellowed, but her mother's handwriting was still clear, still somehow alive. She read it, and as she read, something inside her changed. That sense of breaking slowly gave way to something else, something harder, colder, more resolute. Her father had sold her, but her mother had already saved her. Eleanor closed the box, placed the letter back inside, and stood. She went to the window. Outside, in the garden, Thomas was working in front of the stables, as he did every morning. Eleanor watched him. She had 3 days. It was enough. Eleanor had first read that letter when she was 14. Her mother had not yet died, but she was dying. Everyone knew it, though no one said it aloud. That was how things were in England at the time. Death, like poverty, like unhappiness, was something lived inside the house but never carried outside it. Every day Eleanor entered her mother's room, sat beside her, held her hand. Sometimes her mother spoke, sometimes she only looked. There was so much in those looks that even years later, Eleanor's chest would ache when she remembered them. One day, her mother drew her close and gave her that wooden box. Margaret Ashworth had been a beautiful woman. She had been married to Sir Aldrich at a young age, entirely normal for the time, even considered a good match because the Ashworth family had once been respectable and wealthy. Margaret had accepted it because she had no choice, but she did not want her daughter to share the same fate. Through all those years of illness, through all those exhausted nights, she had prepared something for her daughter. She wrote a letter. She found an old friend in London, a woman who had escaped a difficult life much like her own, and who now ran a small dressmaking shop. She wrote that woman's address into the letter, and she told Eleanor, "I hope you never have to open it, but if you do, do not hesitate." That day, Eleanor took the box, carried it to her room, and hid it beneath her bed. She had understood what her mother meant, but chose not to understand it fully. Because to understand meant to accept why her mother was leaving her with such concern, to accept what kind of man her father truly was. 14-year-old Eleanor was not ready for that. Her mother died at the end of that winter. Her father mourned, it must be said. Sir Aldrich truly broke. For weeks he did not leave his room, did not eat, did not speak to anyone. Eleanor pitied him then, held him, tried to be strong for him. Perhaps that was why she never managed to cry for her mother. She had to be strong for him. But mourning ended, time passed, and Sir Aldrich slowly returned to the gambling tables. At first, once a month, then once a week, then nearly every night. Eleanor noticed, but said nothing. What could she say? A daughter had nothing to say to her father in that time. She simply watched. The servants dwindled. The harnesses were sold. Her mother's jewelry disappeared one by one. Ashworth Manor dissolved from within. Through all of it, Eleanor kept that box at the edge of her mind. Sometimes at night she would reach beneath her bed, feel that it was still there, and pull her hand back. She did not open it. Opening it felt like ending hope. As if the day she opened it, she would be forced to accept what her mother had been trying to tell her. That morning, everything changed. After turning away from her father's door, after sitting on her bed, after the storm inside her settled, Eleanor bent down and took out the box. This time, it was different. Her hands did not tremble, her chest did not tighten. She simply opened it. The letter had yellowed. 5 years had passed, but her mother's fine, slanted handwriting was still clear. Eleanor read slowly. Her mother spoke first of her love for her, then of her own life, how she had been married young, the kind of world she had lived in, what she had been forced to accept. But she spoke not with bitterness, but with a quiet, understanding weariness, as if she were saying, "This is how I lived, but you do not have to." Then she spoke of that woman in London. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, like Eleanor herself. Once her closest friend, she had escaped her own difficult life and built a small dressmaking shop in one of London's narrow streets. She was trustworthy. She helped those who came to her door. At the end of the letter, her mother's handwriting trembled slightly. She had been very weak by then, but her words were clear. "I do not wish to condemn you to anything, but to be free, one must sometimes first be alone. I hope you will be braver than I was." Eleanor closed the letter, sat still for a while. Then she memorized the address, fixed it into her mind, the street name, the number, the district. Then she placed the letter back into the box and returned it beneath her bed. She could not take it with her, too dangerous. But the address was now inside her mind. No one could take it from her there. She stood, went to the window. In the garden, Thomas was still working, his hands in the soil, his back bent, unaware of anything. Eleanor watched him. Thomas had been working here for 4 years, quiet, reliable, never speaking more than necessary, but always exactly where he needed to be. Eleanor trusted him. She rarely admitted that to herself, but she did. She had 3 days, a plan, and now an address. It was enough. Thomas Hale had come to Ashworth Manor 4 years earlier. Back then, the estate had still been somewhat better, at least on the surface. There were more servants, more horses in the stable, the garden was better maintained. Thomas had been hired as the head groom. He was 23, from another village in Yorkshire, and had brought little with him: a small suitcase, a few changes of clothes, and a habit of doing good work. Sir Aldrich had liked him immediately. He was quiet, did not complain, and handled horses well. What more could an employer want? When Eleanor first saw him, she had paid little attention. At the time, she was occupied with her mother's illness, unable to notice anything else. But after her mother died, during that long, heavy period of mourning, Eleanor began to go out into the garden. She could not bear to stay within 4 walls. She walked, sometimes for hours, often circling the stables. And Thomas was always there, working, minding his own business, never asking her questions. Only sometimes lifting his head, giving her a brief look, and returning to his work. It helped her. At that time, everyone was telling her something. Do not be sad, be strong. Your mother is at peace. Time will heal. Thomas said nothing. He was simply there. In time, they began to speak. At first about horses, the garden, the weather, surface things. Then deeper things. Thomas was an intelligent man, the kind who spoke little but spoke well. Eleanor felt at ease when she spoke with him, a kind of ease she felt with no one else in that house. She could not speak with her father. It was not proper to speak freely with servants. She had no friends, no close relatives. In a way, Thomas became the only person she truly spoke with. But nothing was ever said between them. It could not be. Thomas was a stablemaster, Eleanor the daughter of the house. In England in 1847, the distance between such people was measured in oceans. They both knew it. They both accepted it. Or, at least, it seemed so. That morning, Eleanor went down into the garden. Thomas was repairing a saddle in front of the stable, head bent, and did not hear her approach. Eleanor took a few steps closer and stopped. Thomas lifted his head, looked at her face, just for a second. But in that second, he read everything. Over the years, he had come to know her face so well. When she was happy, when she was tired, when a storm was turning inside her. What he saw that morning resembled none of those. It was different, deeper. He set aside the work in his hands. He stood up. Eleanor stepped closer and spoke in a low voice. She did not give many details, only what she had heard at her father's door, the Duke's name, the date. Brief and precise. Thomas listened. His expression did not change. He asked no questions. He simply listened. When Eleanor finished, there was silence between them. A long silence. Then Thomas spoke. "Where will you go?" he said. He asked nothing else, not why she had not left sooner, not what she would do, not whether this was right. None of that. Only where she would go. Because he already knew she would leave, that she had to leave, that she would do nothing else but leave. Eleanor told him the address in London. She spoke of her mother's letter, of the woman, of the dressmaker's shop. Thomas listened, calculating something in his mind. Then he said, "You have 3 days. The horse will be ready, but you must leave at night. You cannot wait for morning." Eleanor nodded. Thomas looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and went into the stable. Eleanor waited outside. After a while he returned. In his hand was a small cloth pouch, something inside it, though it could not be seen what. "Take this," he said. "There's some money in it, for the journey." Eleanor tried to object. She opened her mouth. Thomas shook his head. "Take it," he said. "Nothing more. Just that." Eleanor took the pouch. In that brief moment, their hands touched. They both noticed, and neither showed it. Eleanor tightened her grip on the pouch and stepped back. "Thomas," she said. She wanted to say something, to thank him, perhaps, or something else. She did not know, but the words did not come. Thomas waited. Eleanor said only this, "I know." Thomas nodded. "So do I," he said. And neither of them ever spoke what that meant. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps there was no need. Some things do not fit into words, especially in that time, especially for those two people. Everything between them had always been like this, unspoken, yet known. Eleanor turned and went back to the manor. Thomas watched her. He watched until she disappeared through the door. Then he returned to the stable and began preparing the best horse. It was the only thing he could do, and at least it was something he could do well. That night, when Eleanor looked down from her window, there was still a light in the stable. Thomas was still working. He worked until midnight. Eleanor could not sleep, but this time not from fear, but from something entirely different. She had 2 days left. Before she ever saw the Duke of Ravenmore, Eleanor had heard many things about him. In that small corner of Yorkshire, everyone knew one another, or at least knew something about one another. Gossip was the fastest commodity in that world. Faster than carriages, faster than letters. And what was said about Edmund Hale, Duke of Ravenmore, was far from scarce. He was 54. He had been married once. His wife had died 10 years earlier, and he had no children. He owned a vast estate called Ravenmore Castle, said to be the oldest and darkest manor in Yorkshire, though who knew how much of that was true. That he was very wealthy was certain. How wealthy exactly, no one quite knew. But one thing everyone knew. Edmund Hale got what he wanted, with money, with connections, or by other means. And whatever he had wanted until now, he had always obtained. Eleanor had heard all of this, but hearing and seeing are different things. On the evening of the signing, darkness fell early outside. It was that heavy, cold darkness of November. In the north of England, winter does not arrive gradually, but all at once. From her upstairs window, Eleanor saw the carriage enter the courtyard. A large black carriage, with 2 riders beside it. The door opened. Edmund Hale stepped down. Eleanor found him different from what she had expected. He was not old, not as he appeared. He stood upright, his dress was impeccable, his hair gray, but his face hard. He seemed courteous, the most dangerous kind. It was easy to read men who were coarse, harsh, openly cruel. But those who appeared courteous, they were different. Their politeness was like a covering. One had to look far more carefully to see what lay beneath. Eleanor looked, and she did not like what she saw. As Edmund Hale stepped into the courtyard, he glanced around, at the manor, the garden, the stable, the way a man looks at his own property, as if it already belonged to him, as if only the paperwork remained. That look turned Eleanor's stomach. She had to go downstairs. There was no escaping it. Her father met him at the door. There were handshakes, voices below. Eleanor remained at the window for 1 more minute. She took a deep breath, then turned and walked to the door. As she descended the stairs, she told herself this. It was only 1 night. She only had to endure until morning. That was all. The dining room was cold that night. The fireplace was lit, but it did not warm the room, or so it seemed to Eleanor. The table was long, the candlelight dim, the finest service had been laid out. Her father was doing everything he could to host his guest well. That disturbed Eleanor even more. He was selling his daughter, yet he was setting a fine table. Edmund Hale sat across from Eleanor. He greeted her politely, asked polite questions about the weather, her health, the season in Yorkshire. He smiled politely. Eleanor answered politely, smiled politely, ate politely. Nothing inside her was polite. But she noticed something throughout the evening. Edmund Hale hardly looked at her. He spoke mostly with her father, about land, about money, about connections in London. Eleanor was as if she were not at the table at all. It brought her a strange sense of relief, but at the same time it made everything far clearer. Edmund Hale did not see her as a person. He had no need to. He was buying something, and what he was buying did not require thoughts, wishes, or feelings. The meal ended. Glasses were raised. Then her father stood and invited his guest to the study. The documents were there. Eleanor stood as well. She would leave the table. At that moment, Edmund Hale turned to her. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low, polite, but there was something in it, a tone of possession. The papers had not yet been signed, but that tone said everything. "I trust this arrangement is agreeable to you as well." Eleanor looked at him. What she said in that moment mattered, because Edmund Hale was expecting an objection, perhaps even wanting it. A woman who would protest, cry, plead. Men like him were familiar with that. Eleanor smiled, gently, coldly, perfectly. "Of course," she said. Then she turned and left the room. The door closed behind her. She stood in the corridor. Her heart was beating fast, but her voice had not trembled, her hands had not shaken, her eyes had not faltered. This was what her mother had taught her. Never hurry when you leave a room. Never leave as if you are unsteady. Voices came from the study. The sound of papers, the sound of a pen. Then silence. The signatures had been made. Eleanor went up the stairs and returned to her room. She closed the door. After a while, her father came from below and locked it from the outside. The key turned. Eleanor heard the sound and felt nothing. Not fear, not panic. Only calm, because there was one day left. Morning would come, evening would come, night would come. And that night, Thomas would be at the door. The horse would be ready. And this room, this lock, this key, none of it would matter any more. Eleanor lay down on her bed, closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she did not try to. The final day passed. Eleanor did not remember clearly afterward how it passed. Morning came, noon came, evening came. Meals were brought, plates were taken away. At one point her father came to the door, said something. Eleanor did not listen. She simply said yes, nodded, and he left. That day, time did not move normally for her. It passed very slowly, and then suddenly very quickly. She looked out the window often, at the sky, the garden, the stable. Thomas looked up once, only for a second, then returned to his work. But that 1 second was enough. Everything was ready. Near midnight, the manor fell completely silent. Sir Aldrich had gone to bed early, as he always did, after drinking. The servants had long since retired to their rooms. Outside there was wind, the trees rustled, the moon slipped in and out of the clouds. Eleanor listened to all of it. She knew the sounds of the manor by heart. Which board creaked, which door made noise, who woke at what hour. She had lived in this house for years. She knew every breath it took. She stood. The small bag she had prepared lay beneath her bed. There was not much in it. 2 changes of dress, her mother's letter, the pouch of money Thomas had given her, and a small brooch that had belonged to her mother. She took nothing else. She could not carry too much weight. But it must be said, that night Eleanor looked at everything she was leaving behind in that room. The small ornaments from her childhood, the books on her shelf, the velvet curtain her mother had given her. She was leaving all of it. For a moment her chest tightened. Then she took her bag and went to the window. The window could be opened. Thomas knew it, and Eleanor did as well. It was the second floor, but there was a thick ivy vine clinging down the wall into the garden, strong from years of growth. As a child, Eleanor had sometimes climbed down it, as a game, without her mother seeing. Now she would do it again, only this time she would not return. She opened the window slowly. The wind rushed in, cold, and Eleanor shivered. She looked down. The garden was dark, but for a moment the moon broke through, and she saw Thomas. He stood near the corner of the stable, holding the horse's reins, looking up. When he saw her, he gave a slight nod. Eleanor took a deep breath. She lowered her bag first and let it drop. It landed with a soft sound. Then she swung her leg over the sill. She gripped the ivy. It was cold, damp, her hands slipping. Slowly she climbed down. One step, then another, then another. When her feet touched the ground, she exhaled. Thomas came to her. He picked up the bag from the ground and tied it to the horse. They did not speak. Speaking was dangerous. At that hour, a single sound could ruin everything. Thomas turned to Eleanor and extended his hand to help her mount the horse. Eleanor looked at his hand. For 4 years, this man had been there. For 4 years, when her mother died, when her father collapsed into ruin, when loneliness pressed the heaviest, Thomas had always been there. Without saying anything, without asking for anything. And now Eleanor was leaving. She had to leave, they both knew it. But leaving meant leaving Thomas here as well. Eleanor took his hand and mounted the horse. Thomas did not release the reins immediately. He held them for a moment longer. Eleanor looked down, Thomas looked up. In that darkness, in that silence, in that cold, they both knew everything they wanted to say, and chose not to say it. Because if they had, Eleanor would not have been able to leave, or Thomas would not have been able to let her go. And they both knew that she had to go. Thomas let go of the reins. Eleanor nudged the horse gently. It began to move, not running, but walking slowly, quietly, toward the back gate of the garden. Eleanor did not turn back. She forced herself not to, because she knew if she did, she would stop, and she could not stop. But just as she reached the gate, she turned. Thomas was still there, standing at the corner of the stable, hands at his sides, in the darkness. Eleanor saw him, only for a second, before the moon slipped back behind the clouds. It was enough. Then she passed through the gate and stepped onto the dark, empty road of Yorkshire. The horse moved forward. The cold wind struck her face. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Traveling at night in the north of England was dangerous, but she had no other choice. She could not wait for morning. London was far, the road long, but every step carried her farther from Ashworth Manor, from that locked door, from those signed papers. After a while, the manor disappeared completely from view. In that moment, Eleanor breathed for the first time that night, truly, deeply. The cold air filled her lungs. Her eyes stung. She did not know whether from tears or from the wind. Perhaps both. She thought of everything she had left behind. Her mother's room, the garden, the stable, Thomas. Then she looked ahead. The dark road stretched on, but it led somewhere. It led to London, to the address her mother had left her, to a new life. The horse kept moving. It was early morning. November mornings in Yorkshire were like this. The sun rose late. The air stayed heavy and gray for hours, as though the day itself had to force its beginning. Ashworth Manor was as quiet as ever that morning. The trees were still, the garden damp, smoke just beginning to rise from the chimneys. Edmund Hale arrived precisely at 8. He was punctual. Men like him always were, because they believed time belonged to them, that no one had the right to keep them waiting. His carriage entered the courtyard. He stepped down, adjusted his glove. 2 men accompanied him. Sir Aldrich was waiting at the door, agitated, speaking too much, as nervous men do. Edmund Hale listened as if he cared, and stepped inside. They went up the stairs. Sir Aldrich walked ahead, took out the key. He stopped in the corridor, before Eleanor's door, inserted the key into the lock, turned it, pushed the door open. The room was empty. At first, Sir Aldrich did not understand. He stepped inside, looked around. The bed was neatly made, not slept in, only arranged. The wardrobe was closed. The desk was bare. The window was ajar, the curtains moving slightly. There was no one in the room, nothing in the room, except a small folded piece of paper on the desk. Edmund Hale stood at the doorway. He had not entered. He was looking into the room with that cold, measuring gaze. He said nothing. Sir Aldrich took the paper, opened it, read. It was Eleanor's handwriting, neat, clear, written without a tremor. Only 2 lines. Sir Aldrich read it once, twice, 3 times. Then the paper in his hand began to shake. Not the paper, but his hand. It read, "My dear father, I forgive you, but I could not stay. My mother taught me better. Eleanor." Sir Aldrich stood there, in the middle of that room, before that empty bed. Something happened inside him. No one could see exactly what, because his back was turned. But his shoulders fell. And until that moment, he had never looked like this. Until that moment, he had always had an excuse, always a justification, always a way to convince himself he was right. But Eleanor's 2 sentences had said everything. And to say, "I forgive you," felt heavier than any accusation. Edmund Hale spoke. His voice was calm, low, courteous, as always. But the cold within it was far more evident that morning. "This is most unfortunate," he said. "The agreement has been signed." Sir Aldrich turned. His face was pale. He had not cried, but he was close. His eyes were wet, his lips trembling. He still held the paper. "She will be found," he said hoarsely. "Where could she possibly go? "No," said Edmund Hale. Sir Aldrich fell silent. Edmund Hale stepped into the room, looked around, at the walls, the ceiling, the open window, then turned back to Sir Aldrich. In that moment, his expression shifted. The politeness remained, but beneath it, something else appeared. Calculation. Cold, sharp, precise. "This girl," he said slowly, "left this manor on her own, at midnight, in a planned manner." He paused. "Who taught her that?" Sir Aldrich could not answer, because he knew the answer, and Edmund Hale knew it too. He was not truly asking, only stating it. The answer was Margaret Ashworth, that tired, quiet woman who had already died. Before her death, she had left her daughter a way out, and it had worked. Edmund Hale turned and walked toward the door. As he passed, he stopped, looked at Sir Aldrich. "The £500 will be returned," he said, "by Friday at the latest." He said nothing more. He stepped into the corridor, went down the stairs, and left. His carriage departed the courtyard. Sir Aldrich remained alone in the room. He stood there for a long time, then went to the window, looked outside. The garden was damp, the trees still. Thomas was working in the stable, as always. Sir Aldrich looked at Thomas. Thomas did not raise his head. He looked again at the paper in his hand. I forgive you. Those two words struck Sir Aldrich Ashworth more deeply than any shouting, any accusation, any court ever could. Because forgiveness meant a full acknowledgement of guilt. Eleanor had forgiven him, which meant she knew exactly what he had done, how great it was, and yet she had forgiven him. This was not grace, not politeness. It was the heaviest answer she could give her father. Sir Aldrich folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He left the room, closed the door, went down the stairs, entered his study, and shut the door. No one saw him that day. He did not come to dinner. When a servant knocked late at night, there was no answer. Only the candle on his desk burned until morning. Eleanor reached London in 3 days. The journey was long, cold, often solitary. The first night she stayed at an inn, small, dim, crowded, but safe. The money Thomas had given her was enough. She could manage without spending much. The second night she stayed in a village, in the home of an elderly couple. The wife gave her soup, asked few questions, sent her on her way in the morning. On the third day she reached the outskirts of London, and when she saw it, she stopped. Eleanor had grown up in Yorkshire, a small village, wide hills, open sky. London was none of these things. Everywhere was crowded, everywhere loud. The streets narrow and dark, the air thick with smoke. People moving into one another as they walked. The sound of carriages, the cries of street vendors, distant factory whistles. For a moment on horseback, Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the mass of it. But she had an address in her mind, and she would go to it. Finding the street written in her mother's letter was not easy. London's streets tangled into one another. The signs were small. She had to ask several people. But eventually she found it. A narrow, quiet street, set slightly apart from the city's noise, modest, almost hidden. The cobblestones were wet, darkness was falling, but from the window of a small shop in the middle of the street, a warm yellow light spilled out. Eleanor dismounted, tied her horse to a ring, stepped toward the shop. She looked through the glass. A small room, a table covered with fabric, needles, spools of thread. Dresses hung on the walls, finished and unfinished. A candle burned. And at the table, bent over her work, wearing spectacles, sat an elderly woman sewing. Eleanor knocked on the door. The woman lifted her head, looked over her glasses, first at the door, then through the glass. She saw Eleanor. For a moment she simply stared. Then she stood and came to the door. She opened it. She was in her 60s. Her hair was white, her face lined, her hands roughened by years of sewing. But her eyes were alive, sharp, warm, the kind that saw everything. She looked at Eleanor for a long time. Then her voice trembled as she spoke. "You are Margaret's daughter." It was not a question, it was certainty. She had seen something of Margaret in Eleanor's face, perhaps the eyes, perhaps the posture, perhaps that quiet resolve. Whatever it was, she had not hesitated. Eleanor could not say yes in that moment. She only nodded. The woman stepped back, opened the door fully. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. Just like Eleanor, not a coincidence, but something her mother had chosen deliberately, a small symbol. 40 years earlier, she and Margaret had met as young girls. They had come from similar families, been carried toward similar fates. But Whitmore had escaped, bold, reckless, alone. She had come to London with nothing, started with sewing. Years had passed. She had built the workshop, small but her own. Margaret had never escaped, but she had seen that her daughter could. Whitmore told her all this that night, over tea, at the small table by candlelight. Eleanor listened. She saw her mother differently now, as a young woman, afraid, but thinking, still searching for a way. Her mother had always seemed strong to her, but she had been afraid too. She had not known what to do. She had only known for her daughter. Eleanor's eyes filled. Whitmore noticed. She stood, placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, said nothing. There was no need. After a while, she stood and gestured to the small room at the back. "This is yours," she said, "for as long as you stay. If you wish to work, there is work. If you know how to sew, I will teach you more. If you do not, I will teach you. You may leave whenever you wish. I will not force you. But the door is open." Eleanor stepped into that room. It was small, a bed, a window, a chair, but it had a door. And that door could be locked from the inside. Eleanor turned the lock. Then she sat on the bed. In that moment, something strange happened inside her. She wanted to cry, from exhaustion, from freedom, from her mother, from everything she had left behind. And she did cry, quietly for a long time. She had not been able to cry in Yorkshire. She had not been able to cry on the road. But here, in this small room, behind this locked door, she could. Because for the first time, she felt safe. And feeling safe sometimes allows everything that has been held inside to finally be released. She cried, and it felt right. Then she wiped her eyes, lay back on the bed, looked out the window. London's night sky was nothing like Yorkshire's. There were no stars, only clouds and a distant glow of light. But it was beautiful in its own way, a different kind of beauty. She thought of Thomas. What was he doing now, she wondered? Was he in the stable or back in the manor? What had happened with her father? What had the Duke done? She wondered all of it, but she could not know, at least not yet. And perhaps she did not need to know. Perhaps the only thing she needed to know was this. That night in the garden, Thomas had let go of the reins. Deliberately. That was enough. She closed her eyes, and after that long journey, that long exhaustion, that long life, for the first time, she truly slept. 3 weeks passed. On that narrow London street, in Whitmore's workshop, Eleanor slowly built a new life. She woke early every morning, a Yorkshire habit that did not fade easily. Whitmore brewed tea, they sat at the table, the day began. Eleanor already knew how to sew. Her mother had taught her when she was young. Whitmore taught her finer work, lace, embroidery, taking measurements. Her hands ached in the evenings, but it was a good kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of her own labor. She was also beginning to grow accustomed to London. In the first days, the crowd, the noise had been overwhelming. But in time, she learned to distinguish the sounds of the streets. The smell of bread in the morning, the rumble of carriages at noon, the distant songs in the evening. Every city had its own breath. London's breath was heavy, complicated, but alive. Eleanor began, despite herself, to like it. But some mornings she would go to the window and look outside. And in those moments, Yorkshire would cross her mind. The hills, the misty mornings, Thomas. She would tell herself, "Leave it, it is over, this is a new life." And she truly tried to believe it. Most of the time, she succeeded. But some mornings, she did not. One day, Whitmore, without lifting her head from her needlework, said, "If a thought refuses to leave you, it is something that has earned its place." She said nothing more. Eleanor did not reply, but that sentence remained with her all day. That morning was like any other. Whitmore had left early. She had a client to visit and would not return before noon. Eleanor was alone in the workshop. She sat at the table, working on a half-finished dress. Outside, the familiar sounds of London drifted in. The candle burned. The room was warm. Everything was calm. Then there was a knock at the door. Eleanor lifted her head. It was not Whitmore. She used a key. She did not knock. It could be a customer, or someone else. She stood, walked to the door, and stopped. She did not know why she stopped. But for a moment she simply stood there. Her heart began to beat faster, for no reason, or for a reason she did not yet understand. She reached out, touched the handle, then pulled it open. It was Thomas. He stood at the door. Dust from the road clung to him. It was clear he had traveled far. His hair was disheveled. There was a few days' growth of beard on his face, dark circles beneath his eyes. He had come a long way without rest. He carried nothing, no bag, no luggage, no gift, only himself. Eleanor looked at him. Thomas looked at Eleanor. They said nothing. 3 weeks earlier, in that garden, it had been the same. Everything unsaid hanging between them. Now it was the same again. But this time, something was different. That night there had been a boundary. Eleanor would leave. Thomas would stay. And they both knew it, both accepted it. But now Thomas was here. And his being here said everything. To be here, he had left everything. His work, his village, the life he knew. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Thomas still did not speak, because what he had to say was not something that could be put into words. That familiar expression was on his face, the man who spoke little but spoke well, who waited, who did not rush. He had looked at her that way for 4 years. Nothing had changed. Eleanor took a step back. Thomas's face fell, only for a second, very slightly, but Eleanor saw it. And in that second, she understood everything. He thought she had stepped back to refuse him. "Come in," Eleanor said. Thomas froze. Eleanor said it again, softer this time, clearer. "Come in, Thomas." Thomas looked at her for a moment longer, then stepped inside. Eleanor closed the door, turned. They stood in the middle of the small workshop, tables, fabrics, hanging dresses, the candle burning. The sounds of London came from outside, distant, as if from another world. Thomas spoke. His voice was low, tired, but steady. "There was no meaning left in staying in Yorkshire," he said. "Everything went with you." Eleanor smiled. She was crying at the same time, both at once. When she noticed, she laughed. Thomas laughed too. It was such a serious, heavy moment that their laughter changed it completely. Lighter, more real, more human. Eleanor went to the table, took out 2 cups. The tea on the stove was still warm. "Sit," she said to Thomas. "You've come a long way." Thomas sat. Eleanor poured the tea. They sat across from each other, just as they had for years in Yorkshire, just as in those quiet mornings by the stable. But this time it was different. This time no one would stand up and leave after a while. This time morning would come and they would still be here. Outside, London continued. Carriages, voices, lives. Inside, the candle burned. The tea steamed. And 2 people sat across from one another. Everything that had gone unsaid for years was still there between them. It would be said, but there was no urgency now. They had time. No one would lock a door. No one would sign a contract. No one would decide their lives for them. This was theirs. What happened next? Asterisk. Eleanor Ashworth remained on that narrow London street, in Whitmore's workshop. In the first month, she earned money from sewing. Little, but it was her own. In the second month, Whitmore began leaving her customers she could manage on her own. By the third month, Eleanor was bringing in her own clients. After a year, half the workshop was, in practice, hers. Whitmore never said it aloud, but they both knew it. Whitmore never adopted her. But she did something no mother could have done. She left Eleanor as she was. She did not question her, did not direct her, did not try to marry her off. She simply remained beside her. And for Eleanor, that was worth everything. Thomas moved into the back room of the workshop. On the first day, Whitmore raised an eyebrow, looked at Eleanor, said nothing. On the second day, Thomas repaired a broken shelf, patched the leaking roof, fixed the lock on the back door. That evening, Whitmore set a plate for him at dinner. The matter was never mentioned again. Thomas found work in London, not in a stable this time, but in construction. His hands were skilled, his back strong, he did not complain. In time, he became known as reliable. London was a vast city, different from Yorkshire, crowded, loud. But Thomas adapted. If Eleanor was here, that was enough for him. 2 years later, Thomas and Eleanor were married. It was a small ceremony. Whitmore was there, 2 neighbors, no one else. That day, Eleanor wore the brooch her mother had left her. Nothing more. It was enough. Sir Aldrich Ashworth never returned to gambling after Eleanor left. No one expected it, not even himself. But those 2 lines he had read that morning in the empty room had changed something within him. "I forgive you," echoed in his mind for years. Sometimes being forgiven is harder, because the other person is no longer angry. They are simply gone. And there is no heavier punishment than departure. The manor diminished. The last servants left. Sir Aldrich remained alone in that large house. He began watering the garden himself, not because he did it well, but because there was nothing else to do. After Thomas left, the stable emptied. The horses were sold. 3 years later, Sir Aldrich wrote Eleanor a letter. It was long at first, full of apologies, explanations, attempts to justify himself. Then he erased it all. Wrote again. This time it was a single sentence. "Your mother was right." Eleanor received the letter, held it for a long time. Then she wrote back. A short letter. She spoke of her life in London, of Thomas, of the workshop. In the final line she wrote, "Come in the spring, Father. We'll have tea." Sir Aldrich came that spring, and every year after. Edmund Hale, Duke of Ravenmore, married someone else a year later. A young woman, another daughter of another family, another father with deaths. That woman had no workshop, no Thomas, no letter left by her mother. No one ever knew her story. But that is another story. Eleanor Whitmore, the old seamstress, the owner of that small workshop, died at 82. When she passed, Eleanor was holding her hands. Whitmore opened her eyes once more before her last breath and looked at her. She wanted to say something, but could not. Her eyes closed. That night, Eleanor wondered what she had meant to say. Perhaps Margaret's name. Perhaps simply that she had been well. Perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps she only wanted to look. Either way, Eleanor understood. Some things are understood without being spoken. The workshop passed to Eleanor. She did not change the sign. The name Whitmore remained. It had to. And Eleanor Ashworth, not Eleanor Hale, she never changed her surname because it was her mother's, lived a long and good life in that narrow London street, in that small workshop she built with her own hands. In 1847, a door had been locked, but her mother had already opened her a window. This story is dedicated to Eleanor Ashworth and to all the women whose names we will never know, who stood before the same doors. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, we would truly love to know where you're watching from. Reading your comments is one of the most meaningful parts of what we do. And if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so we can continue bringing you more.